And as I thought about what the phone-based life does to us, what is it like to live on a phone and social media, it brought me back to my old work, to the happiness hypothesis, because what I realized is almost everything the ancients tell us about how to have a flourishing life, how to develop, how to have an advanced spiritual life, almost everything is pushed the other way by a life online. And so, for example, spiritual traditions tell us, be slower to judge, quick to forgive. Judge not, lest ye be judged. But social media says, judge right now, instantly. You don't need any context. Do it now. If you don't judge, you're going to be judged for not judging. So whether we're talking about sort of sitting still and meditating, have stuff coming in, never have a moment of thought that's not filled. So what I realized was something about this modern phone-based life is degrading. And I say that as an atheist. I feel as though I am degraded, brought down in a spiritual sense. It doesn't mean I'm depressed or anxious, but it does mean that my life is qualitatively worse. And if you draw this out over the whole of society, imagine all of American or Western society, imagine most people feeling they don't have patience for others, they don't have any grace or forgiveness or humility. Like if we lose all of those things at the same time, then we are degraded as a society. And if you have a religious framework, you have the language for it, but even if you don't, you feel it. That was my argument. What do you think?
Well, the religious framework is a consequence of the acceptance of a hierarchy of depth. And so religious language emerges when you talk about what's most foundational. Okay, so let me tell you a couple of things that you'll find extremely useful, I think. Okay, so first of all, Mount Sinai is the horizontal and the vertical axis. Now, most of the mythological representations of what you're describing collapse the hierarchical and the divine. They raise the divine above the hierarchical. So the hierarchy extends up to the divine. So there'd be king. So imagine there's you, family, community, town, state, nation, king, God. Right. Now, but God is even more complex than that, because there'd be king, there'd be explorer, there'd be hero, there'd be father, there'd be God. So that's the heavenly hierarchy. Okay, and God is the thing that's at the top of that. And it's ineffable. It's the good as such. You see that in Jacob's ladder. So what happens in Jacob's ladder is that Jacob's a very bad man. And he leaves home. He leaves the domination of his interfering and corrupt mother. And he leaves, and then he swears to change. And he builds an altar, so that's the vertical axis. And it's a representation of Mount Sinai. He builds an altar. He swears that he'll make the appropriate sacrifices, which is what you do when you say you'll change. And then he has a dream of the ladder reaching up to infinity with the angels coming down, right? And the angels that come down are, you could call them avatars of conscience and calling that descend from the divine, right? And so that's Jacob's ladder. And so it's the establishment of the knowledge of that hierarchy of value in Jacob's life as a consequence of his vow to change. And so the intuition that we have of depth in the literary realm is an intuition that different fictional representations portray different levels of that hierarchy. So there's shallow entertainment, which is what we've been talking about with regards to, right. And there's deep entertainment.
Oh, that's good.
And depth has a nature. That's the thing. Depth has a nature. And so your intuition with regards to this dimensional structure is, see, it's also the case that, well, I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that for the time being. But it's very useful to know that Mount Sinai has this. Mount Sinai is the symbolic representation of the vertical and the horizontal axis. I'll give you a cool example of that. So in the story of the golden calf, this is dead accurate, dead on to what we're discussing. So Moses is allied with Aaron, right? Moses is slow of speech. He's not charismatic exactly, can't communicate that well with ordinary people. And God tells him when he encounters God in the burning bush, which is something that calls to him, God says to him, Moses says, I can't be a leader because I can't speak. And God basically says, that's your problem. That's for you to sort out. You still have to do it. And then he gives him a hint. You could ally yourself with Aaron. That's like the separation of church and state. That's a good way of thinking about it. So now Moses has a political element. That's Aaron. And they collaborate. Okay, now later, as the Israelites make their way through the desert when they're lost, Moses leaves to get the 10 Commandments. So that means that the spiritual departs. And the Israelites who are lost and slavish, right, and fractious and resentful, they don't have the habits of civilized self-governing people. They immediately collapse into a self-serving drunken hedonism. That's the worship of the golden calf. So and Aaron offers that to them. So the idea is that if the political becomes divorced from the divine hierarchy, the system collapses into an orgiastic hedonism, which of course obviously that's the case. Right. So this idea is as old as time.
And I like this idea. You're bringing a dimension of depth. We feel lifted up by great literature, great art.
Yep.
A story,
or moved to the foundations.
A story that draws us in, and we contemplate, we experience archetypal human patterns and emotions over time. We can feel lifted up. What happens, what little time I've spent on TikTok or YouTube Shorts, it's just such degrading trash. And many of the boys' feeds end up with a lot of violence in them. That is like, people being punched in the face or kicked in the balls. And because, the algorithm's going to pick up not just what you click on, but it'll pick up how long you watch something. So my sense is that the girls don't end up with a lot of violence in their feeds, but a lot of boys do. And so if you grow up not with literature, not with stories that draw you in for a while, but just with little bits of, sex and violence and people getting hurt, and you do that for hours every day.
Anger is half positive emotion.
It's an approach emotion, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's got both. So it's a high arousal emotion, but it's got that approach element. So of course it's going to degenerate in the absence of anything higher or deeper. That's going to be the degenerative capacity. The question is what constitutes a valid hierarchy of depth? And I actually think that question has been answered. We know what a valid hierarchy of depth is. We talked about it a little bit. It's longer term. It includes more players in the game. It sacrifices the intense pleasure of the present for the future, for the abundance of the future. It's basically what constitutes civilization and the spirit of civilization. And it's painstaking and difficult and requires responsibility and sacrifice. And it has that deeper meaning, because here's a definition of deep. This is worth thinking about technically. The deeper an idea, the more other ideas depend on it for the maintenance of their validity. It's like a hierarchy of games. Yeah, exactly. And so This is also why people don't like to have their axioms questioned, right? Because it disrupts big sections of their... That's what happens in trauma.